The SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, founded in 1911, is now the only institution of higher learning in the United States dedicated solely to the study of natural resources and the environment.
Hello and welcome to Improve Your World with SUNY-ESF. I'm your host, Don Torrance. Today we're going to talk about something that some might consider a paradox, a contradiction in terms, the urban forest. When you think urban, buildings, of course, come to mind. Government buildings, office buildings, entertainment venues, or you think traffic and busy interstates, or even rows of houses and high-rise apartment buildings. But interspersed with all of that construction are thousands and thousands of trees located in backyards, lining many of our streets, grouped together in parks and natural areas. The urban forest. David Nowak is with the U.S. Forest Service Northeastern Research Station headquartered at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He points out the several benefits we enjoy from that often unnoticed urban forest.
Well, the urban forest provides many benefits in that the trees themselves, when they're in leaf, they exchange gases. So the benefit that, although people view the trees from the aesthetic point of view and they see the shade and they enjoy the beauty of the forest, it's the physiological functions that the trees have, this gas exchange that transpires water which cools the air. But it's that leaf surface that provides the benefits. You get such things as carbon sequestration. As the tree grows, it takes in carbon from the atmosphere. CO2 or carbon dioxide is one of the dominant greenhouse gases, but as trees grow, you can see them get larger. Half of the dry weight of a tree is carbon that comes from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So as trees get bigger, they're taking more and more carbon out of the atmosphere.
So literally, when you think about it, if you visualize it this way, you can think about as your car is driving by, the stuff coming out of the exhaust pipe is in fact the same stuff that is increasing the size of these trees over time. A big chunk of the carbon is in fact what goes to building the tree?
Yes, the big chunk that goes to building the trees is from carbon, not all from, a lot of it comes from different sources, but one of the dominant ones that where we're getting increases in CO2 is from fossil fuel combustion or loss of carbon that's in the earth from cutting down trees and things like that. Another big one is air pollution removal. The trees, besides temperature reductions from the trees transpiring that water, evaporating the water, which makes the air cooler, when they do that, they open what are called stomates in the bottom of the leaves, which allow gas to get inside the leaf surface. A lot of pollutants in the air move inside the leaf and are dissolved in the leaf surface and removed, things such as ozone, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide. So trees directly clean the air that way, or they capture particles on their surface, which eventually drop down to the soils. So they have an air cleansing mechanisms. They affect water flows and water quality by removing waters through the system or intercepting water when it rains. So they mean less water into the system through the interception or through the evaporation of water. So they affect the hydrologic system. It's part of the water system, if you will. Through transpiration, evaporation moves the water from the soil back to the atmosphere because there's a lot of leaf surface area upon which that these mini evaporators, all these leaves are out there in the sunlight evaporating water. They also, during the rainstorms, intercept the water. Particularly small rainstorm events, trees have a large influence on those because most of the water in a small rainstorm event will remain in the canopy and never make it down into the stream.
Trees can help prevent stormwater runoff, but that's a limited benefit.
But most of the effects of trees are in the small storm events. When you have the big gully washing rainstorms, the trees have probably a minor effect on that. It's mainly the trees in conjunction with having less impervious surfaces, how we design this urban forest. It's getting the water into the soils so it can move its way through into the stream instead of flashing when it hits the concrete or the tar, moves down the pipes and into the stream. That's where we get these big pulses within the stream bed. So it's a mix of the vegetation and the soils versus having that impervious surface that influences the flow. So trees do have an impact on that, but during the big storm events it's probably more the pervious area, the lack of that hard surface that will have the greater impact.
Rooftops, parking lots, highways, sidewalks, all produce stormwater runoff, as opposed to trees and vegetation, where water can be slowed and taken into plants. Other benefits include energy conservation, but David Nowak warns that can be a double-edged sword, with a positive on one hand and a negative on the other.
You plant trees around buildings, you shade them and cool the air around the buildings in the summertime can reduce energy use. But here in New York State, the other issue is in the wintertime, trees out of leaf, in leaf they can block maybe between 70 and 90% of solar radiation. Out of leaf they'll still block like 30 to 40%. just from the branches of a deciduous tree. So planting in the wintertime, if you shade your building, if you plant a tree to the south light, can increase your heating use. So design becomes very important, but trees can reduce energy use, which then reduce emissions from power plants, which affect air quality. So you have this rippling effect down the road. Ultraviolet radiation, another one. Tree leaves absorb about 96% of ultraviolet radiation, which is important in terms of skin cancer and cataracts and the thinning of the ozone layer in the atmosphere. So having more vegetation protecting people in areas that are exposed to sunlight, schoolyards or the people that are exposed outside, can have an influence on the amount of UV radiation that we receive. You also have many social benefits, psychological. Besides aesthetics, people respond to vegetation innately. Their brainwave patterns change. There's more of a calming sense. So we have this whole issue of people's psychology. And there's been studies on crime, studies on attention deficit, on school studies being enveloped in this vegetation can influence us psychologically and socially in terms of communities.
Like this little oasis, hard to believe that this refuge is in such a small space in between two buildings. So we are led to believe the more trees the better, right?
In general, the more trees the better. It's how we design it. So what we try to look at in our research unit is which species should we have in the forest and where should they be? Because it's the question of what do you want to improve. If you design for water influences, it might be a slightly different design than trying to protect people from air pollution. So in general, yes, the more trees the better, but specifically species that we choose to put in there and the designs we put in become very important at how to optimize or maximize these benefits that we get. Because there are negative effects of having the forest in there too, in terms of, let's say, pollen production. Another benefit that we have that we discussed is wildlife. In some cases that it could be a positive, but also could be a negative depending on the context of, let's say, deer, or if or squirrels or raccoons are getting in your attic. That could be negative, but for the most part, if we feed the birds, and so that design issues become very important on that. So it's, in general, yes, the more trees the better, but we've got to be smart about how we do that.
And management is a central point for the work at the Northeastern Research Station, developing a means to analyze the makeup of a specific urban forest and then determining how to make the best use of it.
Right, large trees, there's a whole issue on this, but large trees tend to generally do better than small trees in terms of, because they have more leaves and larger mass. They produce more benefits, and they tend to live longer for the most part. So there's also, you have to understand, besides the benefit, there's a cost associated with the urban forest, and we have to put this into time context. So if we plant a tree, a small tree that doesn't get as large and only lives 20 to 30 years versus a large tree which gets big and maybe lives 100 years, there's that turnover point that every 30 years, if it's a small tree, you have to replant that tree, and there's a cost, both economically and ecologically, because we have to then drive and cut the tree down and recycle. There's an energy and carbon cost. But versus large trees that live 100 years, you don't have to do it as often. So how we design in the long term to keep costs down and benefits up is the issue of what species do we put in and how much do we want to spend in doing this management. What our mission is within our unit here in Syracuse is to try and understand what is the urban forest, that composition that we currently have, and what's the potential for, what does it do now, what can it do in the future. So we develop computer models. So we take a lot of measurements in the field and develop algorithms to try and estimate, given the local temperature and meteorology around here and the composition, what are those things? How much pollution is being removed, how much carbon is being stored, ultraviolet radiation being blocked, and things like this. And we do it in two main fashions. One is we do a top-down approach using satellite data. That gives you a two-dimensional array of the distribution of, to make maps of the cities. The other then is doing a tool that we built called iTree, which goes in and where you sample. There's certain things you can't get from the aerial approach right now. What is the species out there? How big are they? What's the health of the trees? Where are they located? Things like that. So what iTree does, it's a free program developed by the Forest Service in conjunction with Davy Resource Group, National Arbor Day Foundation, International Society of Arboriculture, and the Society of Municipal Arborists have all come together to release this tool. It's for free. It's at www.itreetools.org, which allows city managers, mainly focused on, we work at the scale of the city or upward, but it can be used at the site level to collect data on their resource of interest. In this case, we're doing a study this summer coming up. We're going to remeasure plots or areas that we sampled in the city of Syracuse to find out how the city has changed over the past 10 years. But you can go and you measure whatever you want to measure. It could be a park, it could be the whole city. In this case, we're doing the city of Syracuse. And from that, you can estimate how many trees there are, the species composition, and then we load in pollution data from the US EPA, we load in the local weather data and simulate with our models what's the pollution removal, what's the carbon storage, what's the energy conservation, and these dollar value effects that you get. So you can start doing this cost-benefit analysis of, forests have an inherent cost involved in them, but there's an inherent benefit. So how do we, what we're trying to do with this tool is get to optimization. How do we design the forest with the species and the locations to maximize or optimize these effects, the positives, while minimizing the negatives and the costs? And that's what we're working towards with iTree. We know the trees produce benefits, and we know they have costs. But the logical first step to understand what the benefits and costs are, to understand is what the forest is. It's all hypothetical until you actually have a measure of how many trees that you have. What iTree tries to get at is how many trees do you have? What we tell our students in the class, it's like trying to manage a grocery store without knowing what's on your shelves. You know there's stuff out there, you can see it. We see the trees all the time. We don't know by counting the numbers how many trees there are and what their species are unless we go out and actually do it. I know it exists because I can see it out my window, but to quantify what it is, it's a lot better to have hard numbers, and that's what iTree tries to give you. It's a statistical sampling design which will give you numbers that say there are this many trees, here's the species composition, and then running it through the model to saying here's the annual effect of these various benefits. And from that, then the cities can take it and make their decisions. Now they have some numbers to go upon. What do I want to do? Where do I want to be? If Syracuse has 24% tree cover right now, where do they want to be 10, 20 years from now? Maybe they want to go up, maybe they want to go down. Hopefully they want to go up. And then how do you get there? Because it takes time. Trees grow through time, trees die. It's now to start making these management decisions so we can plan for our forest 20, 30 years in the future with real numbers instead of just planting as we will. The question of whether you want more is a local decision to be made by either the site manager, the homeowner, or the city manager itself. So Syracuse says, or Buffalo or Rochester, whoever as a group would have to say we want more or less because that's a public investment. Then the question is if you want more, where do you want to put that? So that's when you want to optimize. You're not going to plant in baseball fields and things like this, certain places excluded, but what we're trying to get at through this iTree tools and develop this is if I could only plant one tree, where should it be and what should it be? And then from that we can say, well, if I'm going to plant 2, 3, 4, or thousands of trees, what's the best places within the cities to get the optimal return at lowest costs? And iTree just right now is a start at that because it gives you the baseline information. We're building tools in the next couple of years that will start answering these questions of design. It depends on what you want back from that forest. And that's a local decision again too. If we're trying to sequester carbon or reduce UV radiation or protect schoolyard kids, then you might design around schools. It's a local decision to be made with the tools designed to get you there and ask you those questions of what do you want back, and then from the local decision saying, well, if you want this, this is how you would design the forest. Because the forest, again, changes through time. Again, if we plant 1,000 trees today, it doesn't mean those 1,000 trees are going to exist here 10 years from now. There might only be 500 of them left. So the trees die through time and they grow, so you have this dynamic system that we always think in terms of maybe today, but 10 years from now it's going to be a little bit different because everything's going to be shifting around. But if we make right decisions today in management plans, we can have a better future with the forest.
Again, the website is www.itreetools.org, where they put together a resource center, support services, assistance for data collection, analysis and reporting, and forums for the exchange of information. I'm Dave White.
Coming up, we'll take a new look at what we often think of when someone uses that word forest.
You can improve your world by what you plant in your yard. It is commonly believed that invasive species arrived in the U.S. accidentally. Not so, according to a study by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. They found that half of the worst invasive plant species were brought here intentionally for horticultural use. Gardening with native species is an effective way to deal with this problem. ESF's Improve Your World website has helped to find the right trees and plants. You can improve your world by learning more about it. From black bears in the Adirondacks to the restoration of Atlantic salmon in Lake Ontario and its tributaries, and the growing number of coyotes all across the state, SUNY-ESF offers details in its environmental information series. Do we need to encourage growth or curtail it? Get the facts, then you decide. There's also advice for developing environmentally sensitive landscapes, how to test your soil pH, and what it means.
The urban forest provides many benefits, and the traditional forest does too, of course. In fact, the rural forest is seen as one of several alternative energy resources, like wind and solar power. For instance, more and more people are going back to the future, returning to wood or wood pellets to heat their homes.
So if we go back in time here, wood was the United States' primary source of energy up until the mid-1860s. And when coal came on, of course, that started to shift. But wood was still a primary source of home heating up until early in the 1900s. In New York State, if we go back to, say, the 1920s, and people have done assessments, the state was only about 20 or 25% forest cover. A lot of it had been cleared for agricultural uses, and the forest was being used fairly heavily, not only for heating, but also for making chemicals out of. There was a chemical wood industry. As automobiles started to come on and we grew less hay for the urban markets, for the horses, for transportation, there's a lot of that land that reverted back to forest. And so in New York State now, it's about 63% covered with forest land. So we're a very heavily forested state. When we look at firewood as an option, as a heating option, there is a lot of material in the forest now that would make good firewood. Because generally firewood is lower quality material. It's not the nice straight trees of cherry and oak that could go to saw logs, right, which is a much higher value product. It's the lower value trees in the forest that, they either are deformed or have a defect in them, or the things like beech that just aren't as valuable for other products. There's a lot of that type of wood in the forest right now because we've been taking out the high value material and not making use of that low value material.
Dr. Timothy Volk, ESF Senior Research Associate, makes a case for wood as an alternative energy resource. The big advantage is the environmental impact of using wood because it is a renewable resource, unlike oil, coal, or natural gas.
Right, so if we look at the comparison of those systems, the key component of that is any of these fossil fuels that we use for home heating applications, natural gas, propane, oil, all those things are carbon that has been stored over hundreds of thousands of years, and now we're pulling it up from below the ground and releasing it in a relatively short period of time back into the atmosphere. It's a relative short period of time compared to the amount of time it takes to renew that resource. So we're really taking stored carbon, we're burning it for our heating application, and that CO2 is going off into the atmosphere. The difference with wood is that the wood is growing out in the forest, we're harvesting some portion of it, we're using it to heat our homes, which is releasing the CO2 back to the atmosphere. But in properly managed forest, that forest is still growing out there on the property and taking that CO2 up to grow more wood that we'll use in the future for heating. And when we're talking the future here, we're talking in the next few years. And so really we're cycling carbon dioxide through the forest system for heating applications. So very different impacts in terms of CO2 and global warming when we're using wood relative to a fossil fuel. So let me just give you some numbers. These are more numbers related to generating electricity, but they would be fairly similar for home heating applications. So if we look at the total amount of CO2 emitted from a wood system, including all the CO2 when we burn the gas in the chainsaw and the gas in the truck and those things, we're probably putting about 50 units of CO2 back in the atmosphere for every unit of heat we're generating. Coal, on the other hand, is going to be somewhere up around 900 to 1,000 units. Right? Because it's this stored carbon and there's no cycling of carbon back into the system. Natural gas numbers are going to be in the 400 to 500 range. So it's a cleaner fuel than coal in terms of CO2 emissions. But again, it's stored carbon and we're putting that carbon back into the atmosphere. So making use of wood, pellets or cordwood, any of those things in terms of CO2 emissions is a much, much lower impact on CO2 emissions and global warming than any of the fossil fuel options out there.
But what about the environmental impact of harvesting wood from the forest? It takes energy to cut and haul the wood out for use, plus logging operations can often damage the surrounding area.
If we're going to use energy in the types of systems and the lifestyle that we live now, there's always going to be some impact. Right? there's no energy for free. And people think that we're going to create systems to capture energy and have no impact on the environment, and that will never happen. Wood, windmills, solar, all of those somewhere along the line have an impact on our environment. What we want to do is minimize that impact. The way to do that when we're talking about wood is to use good forest management practices and be wise about the way you're harvesting, the trees you're choosing, the amount of trees over a given area, how the mixture of species you have in the forest. And you can get advice from a forester how to do that, or you can get books on how to do management of your home woodlot if you have a home woodlot that give you very good advice on how to select individual trees out of the forest that would be good for your end use and minimizing the impact on your woodlot or the forest ecosystem that you're working in. So you want to do it wisely to minimize the impact. Likewise, you want to do it wisely in terms of when do you go into the woods, right, to minimize your impact. So if you go in the spring when the ground's wet and it's muddy, yep, you're going to cause some compaction, you're going to create some ruts. But if you make the choice to avoid what are often called the mud seasons, the spring and the fall when it's wet, things don't dry out, then you can really minimize your impact by going in when it's drier and making wise selections of where you're going to access the areas in your woodlot. So don't drive through the stream, don't drive through the wetland, create a path or a trail around those areas to get access the wood that you need. There's a cost in getting that wood out of the forest. There's a cost of putting gas in the chainsaw and gas in the tank of your truck if you're going out with your chainsaw and truck to get it yourself. The amount of fossil fuel invested for the energy that you'll bring back home is very small. It's probably less than 10%, maybe 5%. So it's a very small investment of fossil fuel to get a very large energy benefit from the wood in terms of the stored energy, the stored solar energy in the wood.
Often when people talk about using wood to heat a home, they think in terms of the traditional wood stove or a fireplace. But Dr. Volk says that's changing.
So I think the one here in North America that is coming on most strongly now is wood pellets. And so basically all wood pellets is ground up wood, either from sawmills or processing facilities, or wood harvested from the forest, and then it's ground and compressed to make little pellets. That's a relatively easy and convenient system for homeowners to deal with, relative to dealing with chunk wood in a wood stove or a fireplace insert. The beauty with pellets is you get that material. Most of the pellet stoves now have a hopper or container attached to them. You can dump in a day's worth of pellets into the hopper. It will be metered automatically. Some of them now have thermostats attached to them, so you can set the temperature you want in the room, and the rate that the pellets are fed into the stove will be regulated to maintain that temperature in the room. So the beauty of that kind of system is minimum amount of interaction on the homeowner's part with the system, right? You can automate it, not quite as much as your natural gas system, because you still have to handle the pellets and occasionally have to empty the ash out of the bottom, but fairly well automated systems now if you want to go that route.
Now the next step should be adding pellet storage systems that can be supplied from outside so people could have their pellets delivered by an outside vendor, just like home heating oil or propane, something that's already being done in Europe.
We haven't created enough of a business and industry around pellets here yet to have that occur. So the way that's occurring now in Europe, and the way I think it will occur here in North America once we get to sort of a level of volume that it's reasonable, is that just like the oil truck used to show up at people's homes and run the hose down the alley and fill up your tank in the basement, we'll be doing the same thing with pellets. The way it's happened in Europe is in older homes, people have set up in their basement either a solid container or a canvas container hanging on a frame, and it's hooked through a pipe outside. The pellet truck drives up, pulls the hose out, and they blow pellets into your bulk container in the basement. That bulk container can then be hooked up to your pellet stove or your pellet furnace if you have that, if it's a whole system for the whole house. And again, back to these systems where they are metered in, given the outside temperatures or the room temperatures you want to maintain. And so then you have very little to almost no handling involved in these pellet systems, because they're automatically put into this container and automatically metered out into your heating system. And so when we get to the level of activity with pellets here in North America in communities where people can create those businesses, I think they're going to occur, and we'll be able to remove that step of people having to handle these 40-pound bags and dump them into hoppers.
That's using wood for energy on a small scale, but change is happening on a larger scale too. Medium-scale applications include schools, community centers, hospitals, and similar buildings. They're switching from oil and natural gas to wood-fired heating systems, primarily looking for price stability. At the industrial level, developers are building plants that produce both heat and electricity. Lionsdale Biomass in Lionsdale, New York, is a CHP plant that's combined heat and power. In Solvay, New York, a cogeneration plant previously powered by natural gas is being converted to wood. Well, thanks for joining us for this edition of Improve Your World with SUNY-ESF. I'm Don Torrance, and please join us again next time.